little bit about myself. My name is Jen Weber. I'm a senior engineer at ActBlue, which is a company that helps process donations to um, progressive political campaigns and nonprofits. I'm a member of the Ember core team. I work specifically on our documentation and learning resources and the public sites that you see when you visit Ember.js.com. I'm also the author of the Ember Octane cheat sheet, which is a resource that helps you figure out how to change your old Ember code into kind of the new and modern style. I helped write the Octane upgrade guides. And because I've made all of these public resources, I'm going to skip over some of the nitty gritty details of like specific commands and steps and workflows that it would take to upgrade and maintain an app. A lot of the things that I'm presenting today, the details of the exact commands and some of the challenges you might face along the way, are available as a series on my blog, as well as in the official Ember upgrade guide. So I'm going to focus my time today on kind of the meta big picture. What is the overall strategy for maintaining a very long-lived or large app? Even if you work on small hobby apps, though, some of these strategies will still help you out. But that's kind of the angle I'm coming from for this talk. All right, so this is a picture of my garden from the start of this past summer. This is kind of like my little green field app. Everything is tidy and fresh and new. I've got some little strawberry plants all neatly growing in a row. I have my anti-bunny fence, and it's good. It's not compromised at all. There's no holes dug underneath the edges. Things are looking great. And here's how it looks later in the season. This was like a few weeks ago. It looks like a wreck. So there's weeds everywhere. And this is kind of like a mature app. So, I've got certain sections of my garden that have really grown in a huge way and other parts that haven't been kept up to date. And there are so many places that bugs can hide. And although it looks messy, my garden is very productive. This is like just one day, about a month ago, the things that I brought in from my garden. This is my first season having a garden in this location. And to keep my garden productive, making these fruits and veggies for me, one of the challenges I have is that my work is never complete. I could spend unlimited numbers of hours trying to get rid of weeds, pick off bugs, treat problems, or even just like try to make it look nicer. But if I wanted to do those things, if I'm dealing with my messy garden, what I don't do is make new garden beds and give up on the ones that I have. I'm going to go fix them up. As a developer, similar to my garden, my work is never complete. And if I was to just start from scratch because I had, an old app that's full of weeds, that's not really necessary. I can instead keep to working to maintain my app as it grows, find ways to deal with the messy sections without starting all the way over. In my day-to-day work, I work on a codebase that's about 15 years old, and it has hundreds of thousands of lines of code. There's some Git commands that you can run that will tell you just how many lines of code are in your code base. And it almost seems impossible that it's that many lines. But if we think about how many engineers are in an organization, multiply that times the lines of new code that they write, subtract the code that they remove, which is probably not that much. You can get to these really huge numbers really quickly, and you have to have a strategy for managing that growth. So what I'd encourage you to do as you're listening to these examples and as you're doing your own work is to think of yourself as a gardener? What does it take to make your code base healthy and productive? So I'm going to walk you through a case study. This is a smaller app, but it's the Ember API Docs. And this will probably be a familiar site to a lot of you. This is api.ember.js.com. This is an app that was created in 2015. It's used by Ember developers daily all around the world. And it's one of those apps where like it just kind of quietly worked in the background and didn't get a whole lot of attention, except for the times when Ember's documentation structure, the actual data that backs this, changed shape several times. And every time that documentation source, it was like a JSON file, changed shape, things, documentation gets moved around all the time as files get moved around. Every time it changed shape, there's like more and more hacks and conditionals placed into this app. Our requirements change across time. This isn't because there was anything wrong with the original app. We just didn't know the whole story, and none of us know the whole story about the apps we're building. The best we can do is build something that can adapt and grow over time. And if you're using Ember to build one of your apps, you're already off to a good start. So this app, it's not Octane or anything close to Octane, which means that every time we have to tackle big changes or feature requests, the cognitive overhead to get into this app and start making changes is really high. I probably know this app the best, and I don't know it well because I've really only stepped in when there was something that we absolutely had to do. But we know that our needs in Ember community are going to change across time. And so it makes sense to spend some time updating this app, making it more flexible, making it easier to understand. That lets it change from me and a couple other learning team core people changing things to us inviting the community to help out and them finding syntax that is familiar and things that are more readable. So a few months ago, Chris Thoburn, also known as Runspired, and one of the key maintainers of Ember Data, reached out to me and said, hey, I want to help improve this app. I've got some things I'd like it to be able to do to help show off Ember Data better. And Chris said, if you blog about it, I will pair with you to help make this app better. And I said, okay. So we paired like every other week or so for some number of months. And then later on, I also pair regularly with Chris Manson, who's a member of the Learning Core team. He and I paired on this a little bit, and I'm going to share some with you about what we discovered along the way and what the strategies are that helped us to modernize this app. The first thing we did was figure out what our goal was. We wanted to incrementally Octaneify the API Docs app and make it a good example of how to use Ember routing and Ember data effectively. So when I say Octaneify, I'm referring to the latest edition of Ember. An edition is a set of syntaxes and patterns that we think represent the best way to build an Ember app. So as we're refactoring, we're not changing what this app does, but we're changing how it is coded under the hood. So the steps that we went through were we needed to write down a plan. We needed to budget some time. We needed to see what tools were available to help us reach our goal. We wanted to work incrementally, meaning that each time we made a step forward in progress, we wanted that to get shipped. We didn't want to have like, a branch that doesn't get merged till next year or something like that. We want the benefits to be available as soon as possible to our users and to other people who want to work on this app. We needed to be careful not to disturb the roots of this app. So If I did a great big huge refactor, but I broke things for every Ember developer during their workday, that would be a bad time. We don't want to do that. And then the last thing is we needed to measure our progress. We needed ways to quantify and communicate our success. All right, so this is a screenshot of our plan. The actual items in this list don't really matter. They're very small. You don't need to read them. But the important part of this is that making the plan itself is essential. So what we did was we wrote down everything we thought we could do, all of the options, all of the ways that we could spend our time, all of the different things we could focus on. Then we made our best guess at which tasks blocked other tasks. So for example, we knew that we couldn't rewrite our computeds to use tracked until we were on a late enough version of Ember that we knew it could work with tracked and Glimmer components. That's an example. Then there's other things that were non-blocking. So for example, we could refactor our Ember data models while we are also working on the computeds. We can kind of mix those tasks around. But ultimately, we needed to prioritize them as well. So in terms of priorities, we focused on which things that we were the best suited to set the groundwork of. And then we took the things that anybody could work on and set them aside for later, so that when it's time to invite the community to help us, there's some very well-defined small tasks that they can assist with. So eventually, we deleted half the items in the list that we had made because they didn't block anything and they could be done by any contributor. We focused our time on the things that the two of us really, really needed to do to set the groundwork. So the next thing to do was to budget our time. We budgeted about an hour every other week for pairing. Sometimes we paired for longer if we were really on a roll. And budgeting this time, if we hadn't scheduled that time and blocked it out for ourselves, it probably wouldn't have happened. There's so many other things to do. And ultimately, no one was paying us to do this work. This is like a volunteer open source kind of thing. If you're looking at updating or overhauling an app for your work, what this step means is that you should try to estimate your annual maintenance effort. You need to make a case to your manager, to your team, to your company leadership about why you need to spend time on changes that are mostly invisible to your users. If you want to go from Ember, let's see, you're on Ember 320 and you want to be ready for Ember 4, that's coming out in next month or so. It's not going to look different to your users, but there's going to be a lot of changes. It takes time to do that upgrade. You can estimate this annual maintenance effort by thinking about how many lines of new code per engineer on your team. Like, how many lines do they write? Think about how much time it takes to maintain the work of just one engineer, and then multiply times the number of engineers. That'll give you some sort of very, very, very rough estimate about the amount of time that you can expect to maintain your code base. That's the absolute minimum, because we're not just trying to maintain new work, we have to maintain all of the work that has been done in the past as well. But sometimes if this isn't already part of your organization's process, you got to start with what you're doing this year right now, sell that first, and then work towards maintaining, setting aside the time to maintain the older things as well. The other thing you want to do is, as much as possible, describe the benefits to your end users. So like what I think about in terms of my garden is like there's some tasks where if I do the maintenance work, if I remove the weeds that are blocking the sunlight, it's going to result in more vegetables. If you fix some of the pain points in your application, it can unblock new feature development. There's also a lot of maintenance where you can't draw a straight line between the work that you want to do and the benefits to the end users. Maybe those things can wait. You can factor that into your prioritization. And then, of course, there's the risks of not doing the work. So, for example, we might think like, oh, what's the benefit of updating a version of an app? The users are never going to see it. Why don't we just wait until, I don't know, next year or something? That's risky because if there's a problem with one of your dependencies, like a security vulnerability, and you're so far behind that your version doesn't have security patches for it, you could actually be in a pretty bad spot. And so sometimes when you're doing your maintenance job well, it looks like nothing is happening, but in reality, you've prevented big problems. So try to write down those risks and include them in your arguments about why you should spend some time. Next up is find out what tools are available to you. So when we were doing this upgrade, the two main tools in our toolbox were code mods and linters. A code mod is a program that analyzes your app and makes changes to it when you run a command. A linter is something that looks for problems in your app, things that might be errors or warnings that are about your syntax. So maybe it's incorrect syntax. Maybe it's things that could cause memory leaks. Maybe it's an issue with the way that you've written your HTML that makes your app not accessible. Linters help you catch those things. And if you're wanting to know a little bit about what the specific tools are, what are those code mods and linters that I'm talking about, you can visit guides.emberjs.com/release/upgrading to check those out specifically. But in general, they work something like this. For many of them, you start your local Ember server, and then in another tab, you run the code mod. So here I have npx ember angle brackets code mod and a flag called telemetry. I'll talk about that in a minute. And the path. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, code mod, my app is running on localhost 4200. That's the default for when you start your Ember app. And I'm saying, I want you to run this code mod on all of my handlebars files. What telemetry does is it looks, this is my understanding of it, I hope it's correct. When you actually run your app, the code mod can look at the built output and use that information to determine the correct change to make. So when I ran this on the Ember API Docs app, I can see that it changed 19 files. And what it did was it changed all of the curly brace invocations of my component into angle brackets. If I did this by hand, this would take so long, even on this small app. But when I leverage the code mods, I, a single developer, can make big improvements in just moments. Another tool in my toolbox is lint fixes. So most Ember apps use ESLint, which can help you find problems in your JavaScript files. There's a flag called fix that will try to make the fixes. So if it's small things like, stuff is using double quotation marks when it should use single, or maybe you're like me and you just forget to put semicolons all the time. it'll do those small changes that are fairly safe for you and automate those. So again, I don't have to make changes by hand in order to get my app looking closer to what I want. This all comes with a caveat that the tools themselves are not flawless. Whenever you run these code mods, whenever you follow these linters, you still have to use your human judgment to look over the diff and say, is this correct? You still have to open up your app and click around or run your tests and see that things are still looking as they should. In my case, I found there was one code mod that Chris Thoburn and I ran that didn't interpret like a link to with positional params correctly or something like that. It was a really strange way of doing it in the app, and the code mod just wasn't, no one understood that would even be a syntax that would come into this code mod. And so we had to go in and kind of fix that one after the fact. And our test suite told us right away that something was wrong. So the next thing was that in this app upgrade, we wanted to work incrementally. And that's because huge overhauls are risky. I alluded to this earlier, but we wanted to make sure we didn't break things for everybody. And so if we had one great big huge merge where all of a sudden one day something that's had like 100 commits get shipped to production, like who knows what could go wrong? And it would be so hard to find out what the cause of a problem was. Instead, we wanted to make smaller PRs at each critical step in our to-do list. This has another benefit that people who are working on the app who have bug fixes or features, they get the benefits of our refactor right away. They don't have to wait until like next spring when we finish this. One thing you can do to work incrementally is to refactor your components, your sets of components one at a time. So earlier I showed you a command that ran on all the handlebars files, but you could just pick one product area of your app to run those code mods on, make that be its own PR, ship that, and kind of step towards your goal of refactoring your components. Another aspect of working incrementally is that it means that your idea of done doesn't get in the way of shipping. It doesn't get in the way of your success. If you have this great big branch that you've done all this work on, then you have to get agreement that this is done, that this is enough. Is it done? Are there more things we need to add? And you start having those kinds of conversations. You don't get to avoid those conversations entirely, but you can kind of, those conversations about whether we're done don't block making the improvements on the app itself. And then the last thing is there are tools to help you enforce these new requirements for new work. So let's say, I have my app with 200,000 lines of code. This one's not an Ember app, it's something else. But let's say I have my huge app. It's really not feasible for me to update like hundreds of components at once, but I can install linters and run code mods and just do those styles for new things. So every time someone generates a new component, it needs to pass all of these new linting rules. And that way, we at least don't slide backwards as we're making these improvements. So there's a bunch of tools that can help you with making these incremental updates to improve your app style. One of them is built right into Ember template lint. There's a feature called to do, and you can run a couple different commands that'll take all of the errors in your Ember templates that are caught by the linter and turn them into to-do items. You can even say, I want this to just be a warning for the next 50 days. And then after that, I want it to start failing. So you can build it right into your app that you're pushing yourself to fix these things by a certain date. You can't just say like, oh, I'm going to open an issue or a ticket, and then maybe we'll get around to it in 60 days. Like, no, in 60 days, the test suite stops passing, and you're going to have to make a decision about whether to extend the time frame, fix the problems. It like forces you to have that decision as a company. Oh, and another important thing here for this incremental template linting is that many of the rules baked into Ember template lint help you to make your app more accessible. And so if you're, again, trying to sell the benefit to your end users, this is a huge one. You're allowing more people to use your app as they should be able to. The next tool here is something called Lint to the Future. This will operate on your JavaScript files. And what it does is something kind of similar to template lint. It adds an ignore to each of the places where your ESLinter is throwing errors. And then it gives you this like graph that helps you track across time how many issues there still are to fix. So this one's been pretty stable. This is a very stable project, but like you could imagine, as time goes on, you can actually see these graphs go down as you resolve more of these linting errors. That's the kind of thing that you can put in your quarterly reports or your sprint wrap-ups, or like shout out to the rest of your company. It's like, hey, look at how we started with all of these problems. We've been gradually chipping away at them, and now we're down to 0 on these different things. It gives people a sense of progress and momentum. If you want to enforce linting requirements for new work, so every time someone makes a new component, it's got to pass these rules, there's tools such as Husky. This is a generic JavaScript tool. This isn't an Ember specific thing. Husky lets you say before each commit or before pushing something new code up, it's got to pass these linters. You could kind of write basically script to do anything you want before someone's allowed to push up the code. And if you're going to do something like this, I would use the sense of like enforcement lightly. Sometimes you just got to get stuff done. You don't have enough time to learn how to do the new thing. It's important to share with your coworkers how and when and why they are allowed to circumvent a tool like this. Because you don't want to make people frustrated and hating the process and not able to do their work. We want to be more on like this happy path of gradual improvement. So make sure to communicate with everybody else in your team anytime you put these new linting tools in place so that they know what to do when they encounter these errors. All right, so another aspect here, we talked about don't disturb the roots. This is just like a general rule of thumb. When you go to upgrade your app and change a whole bunch of syntax, it'll be really tempting to do bigger refactors or like just put in tiny little fixes that you find along the way. My recommendation is don't change the behavior of the app at the same time as your refactor and upgrade. Keep a laundry list of the things that could be fixed, the things that you find, make tickets or issues, file them and do them later. If you kind of follow these tangents as you find them, you're going to get really off track. And it's also going to change the nature of the quality assurance testing that you ask other people to do. If I only do internal refactors, I can say to my coworkers, hello, please click test this. There should be no change in behavior. Once I start making other kinds of changes, now I have to say, please click test this. Also, I changed out all of these modals to use this other new format. Can you make sure that those look okay? And every time you add a new layer to that, it gets harder and harder to QA. People don't like to have to review huge pull requests. So try to keep it small. Try not to change too much at once. Another thing is that you should give yourself permission to skip over tricky things. So in this app upgrade, there's a few computed properties that I looked at them and I just don't understand what they're doing or why. And there's kind of like state happening in like 8 different places. And you know what? I'm not going to let that block me from installing these linter and fixing these other problems. I'm going to ignore that file using my linting tools and come back to it later. Maybe I'll open an issue that's just for that component so that I can keep moving forward and also know that I'm not going to break what's already there. I can give it the time and attention that it needs. And I guess I said stability is your top priority. Stability is my top priority, at least. In my day-to-day work, there's thousands of nonprofits and political campaigns that rely on me not breaking stuff. And I take that very seriously. And I try to keep it in my mind. If I'm getting frustrated of like, oh, I just can't clean up all of this stuff. There's still all these messy things. I'm feeling bad about it. I maybe shouldn't feel bad about it. I should maybe think, I have prioritized my work in a way that makes sure that my users have a good experience. Maybe I don't like that it's not as neat and tidy, but I can still deliver on my promise to them. So I've talked a couple of times about how to ignore linting rules. This is one example of how to use and ignore with ESLint. So I have, just as a code comment, ESLint disable next line, and then I have the rule name. So I can add this above anything that I'm not ready to fix yet. It's really important, though, that you come back to fix this someday. This is kind of going to hide that there's a problem. That's going to hide that there's something that needs to be updated. And like, this is fine. I think through, computed properties, they're part of Ember 4. Who knows what Ember 5 will be? Will someone be mad at me years later because I ignored all of these rules and then we never had any tickets to go back and fix them? Like, they'll be able to hover over this and see Jen Weber made this change. So try to make sure that you create a plan for fixing these ignores whenever you put them in place. And then the last piece here is to measure progress. So for my garden, I try to take a picture every month because it's easy to forget just how far I have come. As I'm working, it helps me to keep a list of all of the work that I've done, because otherwise it can feel just like, are we even making any progress? What did I even do last month? I can go back to my list and point to those as my accomplishments. When it's time for me to do things like advocate for a promotion or a raise for myself or for my coworkers, I come back to this list and I can say, hey, so-and-so spearheaded this project to resolve like 1,000 linting errors in our app, and they did it with no downtime and no user bug reports. Like, that's pretty cool. And you only really get to know those things if you take the time to quantify them. I'm also kind of the boss of my garden, so I get to say, like, what is success? But your company or your teams probably have their own definitions of success. If you can tie your progress into your team goals or your organization goals, that's going to help you sell this work the next time you need to do this. This isn't like we do this once and we get to never do this again. We got to do this all the time, continually, every year. And you almost have to think about like selling that work because there's 1,000 different things that we could all be doing. How do we know that this is the right thing? So some examples would be like, how many components got refactored? How many lint ignores have we fixed? What new features of the framework or libraries that we're using got unlocked? How much time did it take? What new things did we learn? And if applicable, what are the benefits to our users? What are the things that we de-risked? by doing this work now and keep talking about those things. So in this Ember app that I was working on, it's not done yet. We are partway through. We've run all the code mods, we've installed all the linters, we've updated all the library versions. We're at the point now where we are refactoring things that the automated tools can't help us with. So to get to this point, where now we have to do some by hand work, so far we have changed 153 files, 7,884 lines of code, but it was only 30 hours of developer time. This is like, 2 people times 15 hours has kind of gotten us to this place. And we're like well on our journey to make this app be like fully Octane style. And we didn't have to do it all by hand. So again, the steps that we followed for this: write down a plan, budget some time, use the tools that you have, work incrementally, don't disturb the roots, and measure your progress as you go. If you're interested to learn more about the labor of maintaining and scaling free and open source software projects, there's this really great paper that was just published this past year at escholarship.org/uc/item/3mz2dokk. This is a great read, even if you're not working on an open source project, because it lists out all of the invisible tasks that go into maintaining any software project. You can use this to help identify the gaps in your own organization's processes to keep your apps healthy and up to date. So again, a lot of the details of what I actually did, what commands were, what problems we ran into, they're all here on my blog, www.jenweber.dev. You can find me on Twitter at jwwweber or GitHub Jen Weber. And if you liked this slides theme, it came from a site called Slides Carnival that has free themes. Thank you for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions.